Welcome back, everybody. We're here on God Doesn't Do Focus Groups. Today we're going to go over Chapter 10. If I give you more, what will you give me? Well, never really a good way to start with the Lord, because it's certainly, that's a cry of the heart to say, God, I do need you. What do I have to do? But I'm pretty sure, John, you're going to talk us through and walk us through how the gospel shows we don't have to do that. So, hope this reaches out to somebody's heart, and, well, let's go ahead and give it a listen.
Well, thanks, Jason. Yeah, last week, if you remember, we covered a pretty complex topic, and the answers around why God will heal and respond to some prayers and not others can be very baffling. But as complex as that one was, this one is, in a sense, as simple, because this is, in a sense, about us trying to buy God off and trying to leverage our abilities to move Him to look at us more favorably. And at some level, that kind of sounds silly, doesn't it? You can't buy God off. Well, they continue to try, and it's even practiced in the church. And it gets at, and I'm not necessarily here talking about blatant prosperity gospelism, which is kind of founded in this desire to have a quid pro quo with God, that if I do these things, you're certainly going to bless me because your word tells me. I'm not talking exclusively about that, but that certainly captures an element of, if I give you, what will you give me? Kind of discussion that we have in our heart with the Lord. And sadly, I'm going to share an example where I fell victim to that subconsciously, but God in His mercy showed me that that's in fact what was going on. We know it's impossible to outgive God. People have said that is a truism, but that's really not what I want to talk about. I really want to talk about what is almost the motivation behind that kind of attitude. What is that really going on? And it comes to, we think God should want to negotiate with us. That He should give something if we're prepared to do something extraordinary for Him, which was the heart of an example I have. And whenever we enter into negotiations, we rarely, I won't say never, but rarely will we ever put everything on the table at first. Because part of negotiating is, can I get what I want without having to surrender what I'm prepared to surrender, right? And so that's part of this thing. How can I get what I need from God without really giving Him everything I'm capable of giving Him? And that's really what we try to do. So let me give a real-life example of what I mean by this, holding something back in negotiations. I'd mentioned the company I work for that led me down this path and introduced me to focus groups. My first assignment for them was to manage a production team. It was a fun job, wasn't necessarily a difficult job, but something that made it very, very complex was it was at a union facility. And because of that, everything was negotiated. Everything from the work practice to the fringe benefits to the hours of operation to how we could discipline, how we could not. Everything was negotiated, which, anecdotally flies in the face of my I want to wing it mentality. That's just how I operate. But so that was a bit tough for me. But during my time there, I lived through two plant-wide contract negotiations where we would, between the management and the union, try to hammer out an agreement on work rules, compensation, benefits, all that stuff, for a period of time, usually 4 years, sometimes 5 years, that everyone would agree to. But interestingly, what I found out through this is that the Department of Labor prohibits either side from putting their best offer on the table up front. They say you must negotiate in good faith. And what that means is you have to withhold some things so that through the process of negotiating, each party can extract something from the other party. I might be willing to give an extra week's vacation, but I can't say that, so I want to get something in return. If I give you, union, that extra week's vacation, I want more hours without having to pay overtime, or some kind of negotiation like that goes on. But it was interesting to see that is really the rule of law, that we have to negotiate the terms. So both sides, the feeling being that both sides then come out of a contract thinking they've won something, or worse, that they cost the other party something that was of value to them. And sometimes in a union management structure, that can be sadly too important. I want to cost you something. Most good relationships are, we want to find a win-win. But that's kind of what I mean when I talk about, God, if I give you more, what will you give me? You know, I'm sacrificing, so what do I get back? And that's kind of our way of telling God he needs to come to the table. We got to have a focus group, and we've got to determine what my contribution is worth to you so I can win something back from you. You know, Jesus warned, right? I mean, he probably spent as much time telling us that the biggest competitor for our heart and our heart's affection for him will be money. It's going to be that. And so he told us to be careful with our approach to money and how we do it. And that got hit home in a crazy way to me. I had a person come up to me who had just come across a fair amount of money. And he approached me and said, "Hey, do you got a second?" And so we go off to the side because this clearly was important for him. And he says to me, "If I give the church a lot of this money, what do you think God would do for me?" And I mean, that was what I called a speechless request. I was so dumbfounded, I really didn't have a coherent answer, but my instinct, and I just blurted out, "Well, nothing more than he's already done." You know, and sure enough, the church never saw a penny of that money because he was trying to buy from God what God so freely has given. But, you know, he wanted to negotiate his surrender if God were only to respond to him in this particular way. And it's not just limited to money, but that's, of course, the big one. I mean, our time and our talent, our energy is another place where we do this. I remember talking to a friend of mine who said he felt called by God to be a missionary. And, we talked about this last week. Being a missionary is not a call to wealth. It's a tough road financially. Interestingly, that aspect of going into the mission field wasn't a big concern to this young man. What held him up was he wanted to bargain with God over his health. He wanted to know that God was going to keep him safe and his family safe before he would agree to go to the mission field. Hard to fault the guy, but at the same time, he was withholding a part of who he was in hopes that God would relent and say, "Okay, I'll call you and I'll modify the conditions of this call." And so I lost touch with him, sadly, so I don't know if he actually ever went to the mission field, but it was pretty apparent that was a problem. And here's where, for me, I have to be transparent too. As we talked, several sessions ago. Yeah. This was a late in life call on my part. I had started going to Bible college at night almost accidentally. And after 6+ years of taking classes almost every Tuesday night, I get my certificate, and I step into the ministry. And about a year after I started in ministry, I'd had a pretty serious heart issue, and that required hospitalization. And you'll understand what I mean, Jason, because you're in the health profession. I had a procedure. That covers everything now. We used to call it surgery, now we call it procedure. So I had a procedure, and it left me in the hospital for a while. And it was while I was in the hospital that God revealed to me that I did the same thing. That I was going, how could you do this? I just agreed to be a pastor. I just agreed to walk away from from a good career and do this, and how could you do this, And so I was confronted with that very same sense of, I've laid this all on the table, and this is what I get, kind of thing. So, and it wasn't ever an intentional thought, but being in the hospital exposed that was part of the motivation in my own heart in doing this. So, I can tell from firsthand experience that this is insidious. It can creep in very subtly. And that's partly why I wrote this chapter, is to help people realize, are they really in that place, and to do that kind of assessment, because I would have said I wasn't. But sure enough, when this major health issue hit, I realized that I had. And so I was like, trying to negotiate with God, trying to insist, hey, I'm going to do this. You need to protect me, much like my friend who went into the mission field. So, It can come in many different ways. We've counseled a lot of marriages, and it'll show up something like this. The husband is frustrated, and he says, I know the Lord is pressing on me that I need to lead gently, I need to lead consistently, but if she would yield to me, then I will do this. And God will not respond most of the time to if-then statements, because all that is negotiating. God, I'm going to do this only if you do that in return. And of course the marriage isn't any better, because God is after surrender, and we continue to try to negotiate with him what's going on. And it's hard for us, because we negotiate in almost every area of our life, whether we're buying a car or trying to find the best deal on a phone, or where to buy groceries. We're always looking at how do we leverage our capability to reduce our cost, to reduce our exposure. So it's very hard for us to understand that God doesn't do that. He's not a negotiating business, as if he's trying to broker peace between warring factions. That's what a negotiator does. We're going to try to broker peace. Biblically, what we have to accept is that he's the offended party. He is the offended party. And now you put on top of that he's also the creator. That amplifies this. And as the offended party, even in our human relationships, the offended party has the right to set the terms for a renewal of relationship. You have to apologize, we often say, or we try to train our children. You have to apologize, you offended. So it's the party being offended has the right, and so God has the right to say, here are my terms if you want relationship with me. No negotiating. These are my terms. You don't accept them, we don't have relationship. And again, that's something we see a lot in human terms. You need to apologize if you want a relationship. Well, I'm not gonna. Well, okay, relationship ends until you apologize, or whatever the situation is. So it is that spirit that says, but God, I'm offering you all these things. Why won't you bend? Why won't you yield? And that's how we, even for me, subtly demanded God come to the table and do a focus group and get some clarity on what have I earned by surrendering my talents to the ministry. What have I? And it's like, oh my goodness, So it's insidious. He just will not bend to that, but it is very, very much a part of church life, as I experienced for myself, in that kind of stuff. Paul tells us that we were enemies and hostile in mind toward God, and that means we hated him. That's our human way of saying it. We hated him. There was nothing about him we wanted to have, but yet he provided a way of relationship. And that way was the atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And he said, if you believe in that work, confess your sin and accept the work of my Son on your behalf, and then follow him in obedience, you will be saved. You will therefore have a relationship with me. And it is that simple beauty, but yet we continue to come at him with, well, I have a different idea. I have a better idea. I have this to offer you. And he continues to say, no, it's only this way. That's why, Jesus famously said in John 14, I am the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. That is, as the offended party, his right to say. And he said, but blessed are those who hear and believe. And so that's really what we're trying to do in this chapter, is to get people who will simply believe that without having to